There's nothing more exhilarating than pointing out the shortcomings of others, is there?
This video is made possible due to those who support me on Patreon, and I'd like to give a big shout out to patrons Bedside Milk, Chris Hutchison, Christopher Spirit B, Conrad Truitt, Dan Ray, Eric Navarro, Flake, Frame by Frame, John Deere, Jose Flores, Joseph Abrams, KB, Kyle Kramer, Mayfin, Majin Weeaboo, Matthew Gay, Ness Lee, and Stephen Dillon. Thank you all for your support. The Leftovers is one of the most frustrating, incoherent, pretentious, yet alleviating, harmonious, emotionally resonant television series in history, which, despite being one of my absolute favorites, I am often hesitant to recommend, since for you it could be a life-altering experience or an infuriating waste of time that leaves you uttering,
"What the fuck was that?"
It is perhaps because of its love it or hate it nature that I have yet to see a long-form review of the series here on YouTube, and thus, this video will aim to serve as a definitive analysis, beginning with a discussion of the structure of the series as a whole, followed by a breakdown of each primary character's arc, and topped off with a brief conclusion in which I attempt to deliver a concise thesis as to what the hell it all meant. So with all that said, let's begin. While The Leftovers has no shortage of brilliant character arcs and thematic depth, the main reason I wanted to make this video was to analyze how the series was able to miraculously redeem itself, seeing as the first season is, to be frank, a bit of a hot mess. And while season 2 is a massive improvement, I would argue its reach ever so slightly exceeds its grasp. It's an audacious experiment, but resulted in a dissonance between the thematic contentions of seasons 1 and 2, which in turn led to a dilemma leading into the show's third and final season. How could it possibly wrap everything up in a thematically cohesive fashion? And yet, they delivered what some would consider one of the greatest seasons of television ever, blending every thematic contention into a harmonious convergence, bringing every lingering character arc to a satisfying conclusion, only to top it off with one of the most brilliant series finales in history. Having seen so many shows over the years lose their way by becoming too concerned with what they think the audience wants, abandoning the very elements that made them so amazing in the first place, to see a show where the writers were able to recognize their strengths, to take some of the most audacious risks I've ever seen, and have it pay off like an absolute motherfucker, was a no-holds-barred, faith-affirming experience. To properly explain just how amazing a feat I consider this to be, we need to start at the beginning. So as I said, season 1 is kinda rough. The series was adapted from the 2011 novel by Tom Perrotta, who served as co-creator of the series along with Damon Lindelof, who, as fans of the channel know, I have quite the hot and cold relationship with. And seeing as the first season was a pretty faithful adaptation of said novel, it falls victim to the same narrative and structural shortcomings. But before we get to that, let's set the stage. The Leftovers tells the story of those left to grapple with the inexplicable disappearance of 2% of the world's population on October 14, 2011, an event dubbed the Sudden Departure. We pick up 3 years following the departure in the town of Mapleton, New York, with our main focus centering on the Garvey family. Father Kevin, Mapleton's chief of police, whose attempts to keep order are hindered both by the antagonism of a cult known as the Guilty Remnant and his growing mental instability. Mother Laurie, once a successful psychotherapist who has abandoned her family and practice to join the Guilty Remnant. Son Tom, who has fled Mapleton to follow a man known as Holy Wayne, who claims to be able to magically hug people's despair away, though this might simply be a ruse for financial gain and to facilitate his predilection for sleeping with underage Asian girls, and daughter Jill, who struggles to cope with her mother's abandonment. Other primary characters include Nora Durst, who lost her husband and 2 children in the sudden departure, Reverend Matthew Jameson, who desperately tries to reconcile the sudden departure with his devout faith, and Patti Levin, the leader of the Mapleton chapter of the Guilty Remnant. However, the Garveys are the primary focus. So here we come to the two biggest shortcomings of the novel, and thus the first season. Perhaps the most crucial decision a writer must make is the avenue in which they tell their story. Specifically, whose point of view you are going to tell your story from, and where it's going to take place. And in the case of The Leftovers, both choices made by Perrotta are a bit suboptimal, I suppose. So let's say I were pitching The Leftovers to some network executives, starting with, of course, the premise of the sudden departure. I would assume their response would be, oh wow, that's a pretty good hook. So who is our main character going to be? Perhaps someone whose loved ones departed and is struggling to accept their loss? Or maybe a devoutly religious character whose faith has been completely upended? Or what about a character who was trapped in an abusive relationship, but then transformed into a headstrong cult leader? Yeah, that all sounds cool, but actually our main characters are going to be a family who were kind of, but not directly, only sorta affected by the sudden departure. Okay. If we look at the struggles of the Garvey family throughout the first season, all of them are sort of, I guess the best way to put it is once removed from the sudden departure. Kevin's main conflict is dealing with the guilty remnants antagonism of the town and how it slowly chips away at his mental stability, which is only exacerbated by his family tearing apart. While of course the GR did come about as a result of the sudden departure, Kevin's actual conflict has more to do with its secondhand side effects. He isn't struggling with losing someone who departed, his faith wasn't thrown into disarray. In fact, the big irony of Kevin's characterization is that the sudden departure really didn't have any sort of psychological effect on him at all. Same goes with Jill. Her entire conflict is rooted in her mother joining the GR as opposed to the departure itself. Then there is Tom, who it is implied left college and began following Holy Wayne after witnessing two of his classmates commit suicide, although whether or not the students did so as a result of anything having to do with the sudden departure, or why and how Tom fell in with Holy Wayne, and whether or not that had anything to do with his mother abandoning their family, and or anything to do with the sudden departure at all, is really unclear, thus making his entire character really underdeveloped, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Now those of you who have seen the show may be saying, well, hang on, what about Laurie? In the show, it's implied the reason she joined the GR was because she lost her unborn child in the sudden departure. And while true, it's interesting to note that this was a change made by the show. In the novel, she simply joins the GR out of despair. I honestly wonder if Lindelof and Perrotta noticed that it was kind of weird that none of the members of the Garvey family lost anyone in the sudden departure, and decided to amend that. But while this does result in at least Laurie being more directly impacted by the sudden departure, it's somewhat squandered by the fact that we don't learn this information until the second to last episode of the season. For the majority of the season, we don't truly understand why she abandoned her family, which not only makes her feel underdeveloped, but I imagine for first-time viewers, a lot less sympathetic. We can't truly empathize with her because the narrative purposely keeps information from us. Granted, I can't really think of how else this information could have been presented before the flashback episode without it being done via on-the-nose exposition, but regardless, it is quite frustrating. The point I am making is that the story of the Garveys in Season 1 is primarily that of a family struggling with one of its members joining a cult. Yes, this was instigated by the sudden departure, but you could technically tell their story without the sudden departure at all, with only a few changes. This is what I mean by their struggles feeling once removed. This isn't the biggest deal, since said struggles are at least somewhat connected to the side effects of the sudden departure. It's just odd that most of them don't seem all that directly affected by the event itself, at least in comparison to other characters who are given less overall focus. With that said, the bigger shortcoming is the setting. When you consider the implications of the inexplicable disappearance of millions of people, like this would lead to massive reverberations across the world, no? Mass religious hysteria, major shifts in the entire fabric of society, and yet Perrotta decided to set this tale in a small Ohio town, New York in the show, which doesn't allow for the audience to get a scope of the full effects the sudden departure had on the world. We get glimpses, such as the occasional newscast of chaos around the globe, the inclusion of the Department of Sudden Departure, a government organization founded to not only aid those whose loved ones departed, but via a painstakingly long survey, try and find some link between those who disappeared, the popping up of cults, and the government's methods of cough cough, taking care of them. But overall, like sometimes when you're watching the first season, you almost forget that, like, oh yeah, 140 million people just fucking vanished into thin air 3 years ago, huh? The full weight of such a catastrophic event just isn't able to be felt when the story is being told in such a small scale environment. However, as a counter to my own critique, I think this was sort of the point. Instead of showcasing the major cultural shifts the sudden departure would cause, Perrotta wanted to tell his tale in a much more scaled down manner by hyper-focusing on a small town community, thus allowing for him to take a deep dive into the psyches of his characters. So in that respect, the setting serves the story well. However, when the series was picked up by HBO, Lindelof, given his past experience in the industry, was probably aware that this sort of contemplative storytelling doesn't lend itself all that well to television. Things like internal monologues or long blocks of prose, while fine in a novel, simply don't work in a visual medium. You have to express a character's inner thoughts through action, and thus confront them with situations where they are forced to take action. This in turn is most likely what led to many of the changes made from book to screen. In the novel, Kevin is the mayor of Mapleton, while in the show he is the chief of police, thus giving him a much more active role in facing off against the guilty remnant, who, in the show, are far more antagonistic towards the townspeople. In the novel, he is more hands-off and passive in his dealings with them. The character of Patti has only a very minor role in the novel, and the entire culmination of Kevin's dealings with her in the show, when he, during a fugue state brought about by his mental instability, kidnaps and holds her hostage, which leads to her suicide, is nowhere to be found. Same deal with the townspeople eventually revolting against the GR, which serves as the climax of the season. I'd say the show does a pretty good job of adding a decent amount of conflict, particularly in regard to Kevin's dealings with the GR. Other valuable additions include Kevin's possible psychosis, his relationship with his father, Kevin Garvey Sr., the former police chief who suffered from a psychotic break following the sudden departure, Laurie losing her unborn child, not only giving the character of Matt Jameson, who is an extremely minor character in the novel, a much larger role, but making him and Nora siblings. Since Matt's goal is to reveal the wrongdoings of those who departed to prove that the sudden departure was not the biblical rapture, this inevitably causes tension between the two. Matt even goes so far as to reveal to Nora that her husband was cheating on her. But while the show undoubtedly made some excellent changes and additions to the source material, the remnants of said source material still persist and muddle the narrative, mostly in how the show balances its various subplots. For example, in the book, there is a whole subplot about the developing sexual tension between Kevin and Jill's best friend Amy, which is meant to illustrate Kevin's psychological isolation. But since in the show Kevin's turmoil is communicated more via his mental instability, the whole Amy subplot becomes redundant and is hardly developed. Like, there are moments where it hints at a sexual tension between the two, but I don't know why they didn't just cut them, since they don't really build towards anything, and in retrospect just come off as kinda weird. Semi-related, Jill's entire role in season 1, and really the series, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there, is pretty subpar. It's basically the same as it is in the novel, and that's the problem. Jill isn't given much to do, and just sort of mopes around a lot, being like, when my mom joined a cult. Like, bitch, who's hasn't? The show's change of having her threaten to join the GR come the end of the season to entice her mother to leave is a nice touch, but doesn't make up for her just putzing around like a whiny brat for the bulk of the season. Tom's subplot is also pretty mid. Following Holy Wayne's compound being raided by the government, Tom goes on the run with a young girl named Christine, who believes her child fathered by Wayne is meant to be some sort of savior. You'd think a subplot involving two people going on the run from the government to protect what might be the Messiah child would be gripping, but it runs into its own pitfalls. For one, it literally has nothing to do with anything going on in Mapleton. At least with Jill, like, you know, she's there. Tom's subplot has so little to do with what's going on with his family and the GR that every time we cut to his story, it's more or less a drag. It all builds the Christine giving birth to her daughter Lily, abandoning her, and Tom later leaving the baby on his father's doorstep where she is found by Nora, which is a great cap to the season, signifying a possible fresh start for our main characters. But again, since Tom's ordeal is completely disconnected from the events going on in Mapleton, it makes the entire plotline feel like one big contrivance to get the baby on the doorstep. Also, Tom questioning his faith in Wayne doesn't really hold that much weight, since we never really understand why he was drawn to him in the first place. Then there's Meg. So in both the novel and the show, Meg is a woman recruited by the GR and assigned to Laurie, who is tasked with showing her the ropes. But that is right about where the similarities end. In the novel, their relationship is far more developed and even becomes quasi-romantic. Their subplot reaches its climax when Laurie is ordered to kill Meg as a sacrament, but refuses to do so, which in turn leads to Meg shooting herself, after which Laurie flees town. But in the show, while Laurie and Meg do bond a bit, since Patti is made into a much larger character, she is given most of the GR screen time, and the relationship between Laurie and Meg gets pretty much dropped about halfway through the season. I actually like how they end up developing Meg in season 2, but her role in season 1 is pretty uneven. Then there is the guilty remnant itself. In the novel, they are explicitly communicated to be a religious organization, so their motivations for doing what they do, namely trying to ensure the people of Mapleton don't forget that the sudden departure occurred, are implied to be their belief that the sudden departure was an act of God, signifying the end times. Thus, this explains their embracement of nihilism. The all-white clothing, the smoking, all revolving around the idea that nothing really matters anymore since they are in the midst of the apocalypse. But in the show, they are portrayed as ostensibly secular. Now, on one hand, I kind of fuck with this. I think using religion as a boogeyman, especially in the context of some loony cult, is overdone and a bit of a cop-out. The problem is that since the religious context is removed, the show does a terrible job of establishing the GR's motivations, their end goals, in short, what their fucking deal is. Now, I will discuss the GR and what their ideology is meant to symbolize later on, but at the time of the first season's airing, this was one of the most consistent complaints about the show. The GR is supposed to be the main antagonist, yet we the audience don't really get a coherent sense of what they are trying to do and or what they believe and why. This was such a common criticism, there are even a few tongue-in-cheek references to it in season 2. Finally, there is the relationship between Kevin and Nora. Considering just how central it becomes to the show, especially in the final season, it is astounding rewatching season 1 and seeing how underdeveloped their romance is. They don't even speak to each other until episode 4 and only share, I want to say 8 or 9 minutes of screen time together over the course of the entire season. The chemistry between Justin Theroux and Carrie Coon is fucking electric, and making their relationship the central focus of the show was absolutely the right call. But it was a little weird that they didn't spend all that much time building it up, and then at the end of the season, Nora says she may have loved Kevin, and it's bitch, you've been dating a couple months tops. Slow your fucking roll. So yeah, to wrap things up, the first season is extremely uneven, and for most fans stands as the weakest of the show. There were a number of excellent changes they did make, but by trying to incorporate so many of the novel's subplots in conjunction with the show's original additions, it all just came out messy and sporadic. Right about now, some of you may be a bit confused, seeing as I began this video by stating just how incredible The Leftovers is, which was immediately followed by me criticizing the fuck out of it. However, don't let me be mistaken. Season 1 not only laid the groundwork for what would come after, but in a way, served as a test run, if you will, a necessary learning experience. I see this happen all the time with sitcoms. The first season or two is usually pretty rough, but once it clicks, the show dramatically improves. The writers have found out what works, they have gotten a feel for their characters and their dynamics, and at some point the writing becomes effortless. This is why a lot of sitcoms begin to hit their stride around season 3 or 4. However, while this is a pretty common occurrence with sitcoms, it is quite the rarity when it comes to more prestigious dramatic television. If a studio is footing the bill for a professionally produced, high-budget series, and the first season doesn't land, doesn't bring in the numbers, doesn't get a decent critical reception, it's a lot less likely that the studio is going to give them another shot. While The Leftovers was praised for its performances, ambition, and absolutely incredible score by Max Richter, overall it received more of a mixed reception, with most reviewers taking issue with the show's lack of focus and inconsistent tone. And considering it didn't exactly kill it in terms of ratings, the fact that it received a second season at all was pretty impressive, but it wouldn't mean much if the show wasn't able to learn from the faults of its first season. And as we will go over, it most certainly did, pushing aside what didn't land and embracing what did. But undoubtedly the biggest lesson Lindelof and co learned from season 1 was to embrace what I will refer to as the singular POV episodic structure. My biggest critique of Lindelof's writing, most notably his work on Lost and HBO's Watchmen, is that while he undoubtedly is able to think of unique ideas, he often isn't able to rein them in, thus leading to said ideas overshadowing the actual characters. So the question would be, how can one keep this from happening? Enter the singular POV episodic structure, which is the idea that in a given episode, you focus on a single character for the vast majority, if not the entirety of said episode, and never leave their individual POV. It's actually interesting looking back that despite my criticism of Lindelof's other work, the instances where he adopted this structure in his other shows were the ones I praised the most. This structure allows you to experiment with new ideas and concepts while keeping the episodic narrative focused on characterization. And thus, it's no surprise that the standout episodes of the first season all follow this principle. Specifically, Episode 3, 2 Boats and a Helicopter, which follows Matt's efforts to keep his church from being foreclosed. Episode 6, Guest, chronicling Nora's attendance at a Department of Sudden Departure conference in New York City. And, to a lesser extent, Episode 9, The Garveys at Their Best, which details the actions of each member of the Garvey family leading up to the sudden departure. While each episode does to some extent move the overarching plot of the season forward, its primary concern is adding to the characterization of its subject or subjects, while sticking to a singular bottle-esque premise. And clearly this structure paid off. So much so that Lindelof decided to stick with it for almost every episode of the second season. And considering that I have exhausted myself breaking down season 1, so I know I may rub a number of fans the wrong way with the title for this section, seeing as season 2 is considered by many to not only be the best season of the show, but the closest the medium has ever come to perfection. While I have no disagreement with season 2 being one of the greatest seasons of television of all time, when I say that it is flawed, I am speaking in terms of how it meshes with season 1. When discussing or analyzing a television series, while you can of course critique individual episodes or seasons, if we are discussing the series as a whole, we have to analyze how each season fits together. And this is where I take issue with season 2, but we'll get to that later. Allow me to suck its dick for a little while. We pick up with the Garvey clan following the finale of season 1. Where Kevin and Jill return home to find Nora with the infant Lily. Kevin and Nora pursue a relationship and end up adopting Lily, later deciding to move to Jardin, Texas, where Matt and his wife Mary have already relocated to. Jardin, dubbed Miracle by its residents, is believed to have magical properties, given the fact that the town of 9,261 residents did not see a single departure on the 14th. Kevin and Nora move in next door to the Murphys. Husband John, a firefighter who has a ferocious distaste for anyone who claims to possess mystical abilities and employs drastic measures to purge them from his community. Wife Erica, who, while she enabled her husband's vigilantism, is growing tired with his vendetta consuming him. Son Michael, a junior preacher who has a budding romance with Jill, and daughter Evie, who plays a vital role in the main conflict of the season. The first night Kevin and co arrive in Jardin, Kevin has another fugue episode, and awakens face down in a drained creek in an apparent suicide attempt, which just so happens to coincide with the disappearance of Evie and two of her friends. As the entire town enters crisis mode, with many fearing that the girls may have departed, Kevin seeks to discover what truly happened that night and whether or not he had a hand in their disappearance. So with the main premise and conflict of the season established, let's discuss how much of a massive improvement Season 2 is over Season 1 from a storytelling perspective. The first major upgrade is the setting. In contrast to Mapleton, which as I already went over didn't allow the show to explore how much of an impact the sudden departure had across the globe, by moving the story to Jarden, the show gets the best of both worlds. The scale is still small enough that the narrative can focus on the dynamics of the characters, but the fact that the townsfolk believe it is a magical place allows us to get a better sense of how the sudden departure affected those who were, quote-unquote, spared. In Season 1, the thematic focus was more on the grief of those who lost someone in or whose lives were inexplicably changed by the effects of the sudden departure. But Season 2 shifts its focus towards exploring how new belief systems come about in response to such a traumatizing event. There is no evidence that the town of Jarden is in fact magical. The fact that no one departed on the 14th could have been completely arbitrary, but this doesn't stop its residents and others across the world from believing it is. Via the residents of Jarden, we see how people put their faith in certain ideas as a means of finding meaning. There is Jerry, who believes his killing of a goat on the 14th is what spared them, and now waltzes around town sacrificing goats wherever the hell he damn well pleases. There is Cecilia, who believes they were spared due to her trying on her wedding dress on the day of the sudden departure, and now wears it all the time, taking photos with tourists. A small detail I love is how Michael takes samples of the town's water and sells it to tourists, but doesn't name a price. The buyers can pay whatever they want for it. The idea being that there is no inherent meaning or value in any of these things aside from what one assigns to it. It feels like a natural shift, from struggling with the despair of losing loved ones to finding something to fill the void. This theme was somewhat touched upon in Season 1, but in Season 2, it becomes the primary thematic focus. Then there are the new additions to the cast. John is such a tremendous antagonist for the season, a man who despises anything to do with mysticism, who finds himself in the center of a so-called miraculous place and fights against it even as it threatens to tear his family apart. Erica serves as a perfect foil for Nora. Erica's belief that she is responsible for Evie's disappearance clashing with Nora's denial of her own belief that she is responsible for the departure of her husband and children. Michael is okay. He doesn't have the biggest role, but at least he does more than Jill did in Season 1. The season was also smart to introduce a lingering mystery to keep the story on track. In Season 1, while the escalating tension between the people of Mapleton and the GR was done well, it was at times a bit too much of a slow burn. Shit really didn't pop off until the last few episodes. Whereas in Season 2, the tension of Kevin possibly having something to do with Evie's disappearance keeps the audience on the edge of their seats even as the narrative slows down to focus on character development. Season 2 also sees the inclusion of Patti, who, following her death in Season 1, appears to Kevin throughout the season, which is something some critics took issue with, but I really don't see why. Not only do we see the return of the incredible Ann Dowd, not only is there at times hilarious, at others heart-wrenching back and forth, an absolute delight, not only does the question as to whether or not Patti is an actual specter of some sort, or simply a manifestation of Kevin's subconscious keep the audience guessing, but it is a simple yet extremely effective storytelling tool to give us insight into Kevin's character. While you can certainly get a sense of Kevin's characterization in Season 1, there are times where he is a bit of an enigma, and his dream sequences, more often than not, came off as abstruse. In contrast, Patti's dialogue with Kevin is pretty clear-cut and allows us to get a sense of what makes him tick. Now some may ask, isn't on-the-nose dialogue or exposition a bad thing? Well, it depends on the context. When it is blatantly obvious it is only being used to communicate information to the audience? When it is a natural extension of the context of the scene? As illustrated in Season 1, Kevin holds a great deal of conflicting feelings about his life. There is one side of him that loves his family and wants to be with them above all else. And then there is the other side that is horrified by the commitment said family comes with and wants to escape. Patti is representative of that latter side of him. Her antagonism is a visual representation of the mental conflict raging within him. Season 2 also spends a lot more time exploring Kevin and Nora's relationship, how there is undoubtedly chemistry between the two, but also calling attention to the massive elephant in the room, namely the question of whether they actually love each other or are just together as a means to keep their minds off their respective traumas. Is their relationship simply, as Patti puts it, damage control, which in turn lays the necessary groundwork that will ultimately lead to the conclusion of each character's series arc. But of course, the biggest improvement is its commitment to the singular POV episodic structure, with the majority of episodes following a set POV. In order, the Murphys, Kevin, Laurie, and Tom. Episode 4 is a bit of an outlier as it does not stick to the POV of a particular character or set of characters. Not so coincidentally, it is often cited as the weakest of the season. Matt, Nora, and Erica, 2 Kevin episodes in a row, Meg, and the finale being a free-for-all, as the narrative reaches its climax and all the characters' points of view collide. Now, while I am clearly a champion of this method, it does have potential drawbacks. While it is a great way to keep your episodic narratives focused, it can make it more difficult to develop the overarching season plot, since you can't just jump from POV to POV on a whim. In Season 1, while the individual POV episodes were excellent, they didn't push the season's overarching plot forward all that much. They felt more like detours, if you will. But Season 2 does a much better job of employing the singular POV method while still having each episode be essential to the major narrative. Even the episodes that detour the most extensively, Episode 3, Off Ramp, which catches up with Laurie and Tom trying to help GR members escape the cult, and Episode 9, 1013, which chronicles the events following Meg taking control of the Mapleton GR, are essential in moving the characters into position to facilitate the grand finale. Season 2's ability to simultaneously stand as a series of individual mini-narratives while collectively making up a singular cohesive story, something many shows try but few succeed to accomplish, is why the season is considered one of the finest of all time. And if you are an aspiring television writer, one I highly recommend studying. I could go on and on about all the minor brilliances of Season 2, but for now, let's get back to the overarching season plot. The majority of the season is driven by Evie's disappearance and the effects it has on the citizens of Jarden, particularly Kevin, who attempts to discover his possible role in said disappearance, all the while dodging the suspicions of John and the antagonism of Patti, both of which threaten to destroy his relationship with Nora. In order to rid himself of Patti's torment and learn once and for all what happened to Evie, Kevin seeks out a man named Virgil, who just so happens to be Erica's father. Virgil tells Kevin that the only way to get rid of Patti is to, well, die. It turns out Kevin, in another fugue state, had paid a visit to Virgil the first night he arrived in Jarden, during which Virgil relayed the same information to him, that he would have to die to get rid of Patti. This is what Kevin was trying to do when he jumped into the creek with a cinder block tied to his ankle, only to be spared when an earthquake caused the water to drain. Sort of silly considering he didn't have an exit strategy, but now he has Virgil to help. Upon dying and entering the realm of the dead, Kevin will have to do battle with and defeat Patti, after which Virgil will resurrect him via a shot of adrenaline. Desperate to save his relationship with Nora, Kevin drinks a specially concocted poison and, well, dies. But Virgil, instead of reviving Kevin like he said he would, blows his fucking brains out and then... Okay, so I obviously have spoiled a great deal of the show so far, so if you've watched this video up until now, you either have already seen the show or don't care about having it spoiled for you. However, I urge you, for those of you who have not seen the show, if this video has inspired you to give it a shot, turn this shit off right now and go watch it. Because what happens next is perhaps one of the biggest, most audacious, most unprecedented narrative turns in television history. I would hate for you to deprive yourself of it, so no hard feelings if you close this video and go watch it right now. But for those of you who are still here, it is time to talk about...
You're an international assassin. Are you fucking serious?
International Assassin is not only considered by many the undisputed best episode of the series, but one of the greatest episodes of television of all time. Upon taking the poison, Kevin awakens in some sort of metaphysical hotel, where he takes on the persona of an international assassin, who is tasked with killing Patti, who in this realm is a US Senator running for president. Obviously, if you are a fan of The Sopranos, unlike me of course, you will note the obvious influence of the episode Join the Club, in which Tony, while in a coma, awakens in a hotel believing he is a mild-mannered salesman. However, The Sopranos had already established extended dream sequences, so it wasn't totally out of left field. International Assassin, on the other hand, most certainly was. This episode was literally unlike anything that came before it in the series and is an absolutely insanely batshit good-ass time. And yet, despite just how balls to the wall surreal and hilariously absurd the episode is, it is also one of the most substantive. While Kevin taking on the persona of an assassin being tasked with killing Patti is an incredibly creative narrative device to depict him ridding her from his subconscious, said persona is also symbolic of the side of Kevin that has the inner desire to be free of his commitments and responsibilities. The part of Kevin that wants to shed himself of these burdens, to run, to escape, hence his habit of trying to blow up his own life, by cheating on Laurie in season 1, and by trying to get himself jailed for Patti's death in season 2. In order to return to his family, he has to embrace the part of himself that is the main threat to that very goal. Now, I don't want to dive too deep, since we will be discussing this episode's significance to his arc in depth later on, but also because, while Kevin is the POV character, the episode is just as, if not more so, a dissection of Patti's psyche. In order to dispel Patti from his conscience, Kevin must not simply kill the version of her he knew, the manipulative cult leader, in this realm represented as a cutthroat senator, but the victim of abuse at the hands of her ex-husband, represented as an innocent young girl. And in the end, Kevin must see Patti as the totality of the woman she was. Not simply a victim, not simply a tyrant, but a broken, flawed, scared human being, just like himself. It is only then he is able to return to the realm of the living, now free of her torment. It is an absolute delight and undoubtedly one of the best episodes of the entire series. However, it also could be considered the absolute worst episode, seeing as it potentially breaks the show's entire thematic messaging, but you know what, we'll dive into that a little later. The next and penultimate episode of the season chronicles Meg's past, how her mother died the day before the sudden departure, and how she had visited Jarden seeking solace but found nothing, thus setting up her eventually joining the GR. We learn Meg took over the Mapleton GR after Patti's disappearance and began employing far more drastic and extreme methods. It all builds to the reveal that not only is Meg planning a GR assault on the town of Jarden, but Evie and her friends faked their disappearance and in actuality were recruited by Meg into joining the GR. The finale sees Meg and the GR enacting their assault on Jarden, symbolically stripping it of its supposed status as a miraculous safe haven, and every conflict presented throughout the season reaching its peak. There are so many great individual moments. Jill and Laurie's brief but cathartic quasi-reconciliation, the climactic face-off between John and Kevin, my personal favorite moment in which Erica desperately tries to reach out to Evie to leave the GR and come home, even as she ignores her mother's pleas while choking back her palpable emotion, an absolutely heart-wrenching scene. But of course, the biggest beat of the finale comes when John shoots Kevin and inadvertently sends him back to the realm of the dead, which Kevin isn't too happy about. However, this time, instead of donning the persona of the assassin, Kevin takes on the role of the police chief, the savior, the man who will do anything to return to his family, and after showing off his mad dope karaoke skills, returns to the realm of the living. The finale ends with Kevin making his trek through a fiery Jarden, echoing the finale of season 1, him reconciling with John, and finally, returning home to find all of his loved ones waiting for him, capping an incredible season off with an immeasurably cathartic culmination. So that was a whole lot of praise. Now let's change gears a bit. In terms of general complaints, once again, Jill and Tom are sort of given the shaft. Jill's confrontation with Laurie at the end of the season was good, but for the most part she had basically nothing to do. Even her romance with Michael doesn't go anywhere. I think the writers simply just didn't know what to do with her. Tom, like in season 1, felt more like a plot device than a character. Him being thrown around willy-nilly to meet whatever ends the writers needed. I'll discuss how I think Jill and Tom were let down by the show more in depth in their own character section. The only other criticism I have of the entire season is the scene in which Meg rapes Tom. It just felt so completely unnecessary. Some argue that it was a method of her establishing dominance and power over Tom, but literally right after this she performs a mock execution, so yeah? Others argue it was meant as a manipulation tactic to fuck with Tom's head and try to bring him over to the GR. But to me, that seems a bit weak. He was starting to have doubts about the effectiveness of his and his mother's attempts to help reform other GR members, but Meg would have no way of knowing this. I'm not saying you can't use rape or sexual assault in your narrative, but in this case it felt mostly, if not entirely, for shock value. Aside from these not so massive criticisms, it seems as though season 2 is ostensibly a perfect season of television. Well, okay, but what was all that about season 2 being a flawed experiment then? You know how earlier I discussed how when analyzing a series as a whole, you can't just isolate each individual season, but rather how the seasons mesh or don't mesh with each other? The issue with season 2, particularly International Assassin, despite its brilliance, is that it breaks the one rule that had been established since the pilot, which is that every supposed supernatural occurrence always had a rational alternative explanation. Did Holy Wayne truly have powers, or was it all a ruse? Was Matt's failed attempt to save his church from foreclosure a test from God, or simply a horrendous amount of bad luck? When Kevin attempted to drown himself and was saved by an earthquake, was this divine intervention or simply one hell of a lucky break? Was Jordan truly spared by some greater power, or was it just happenstance that not a single person in the town departed on the 14th? Is the Patti that appears to Kevin her actual spirit, or a manifestation of his own psyche? Did the 10-minute long season intro with the prehistoric woman have literally anything to do with anything in the show, or was it simply put there to allow the audience to derive whatever meaning from it they choose? The show does not give conclusive answers to these questions, which is the entire point. The idea is to allow the audience to interpret these events based on their own sensibilities. However, this only works if the truth is left ambiguous. Now, some of you may be saying this idea is completely bunk because, well, hello, sudden departure. Well, the sudden departure is an exception to the rule. The point of the sudden departure from a storytelling perspective was simply to present a completely inexplicable occurrence in order to, quote-unquote, reset the basis of human belief. After the sudden departure, the entire world was thrown into chaos. Everything everyone believed was completely upended, and thus, they had to start anew. Find new belief systems, find structures to put their faith into. And that is what the series explores from there on out. Then again, the sudden departure doesn't even technically break this rule, since what caused it is never conclusively disclosed, and in both seasons 2 and 3, there are more scientific and or rational explanations proposed. But International Assassin does break this rule, since it seems to conclusively imply that Kevin does in fact travel to some alternate metaphysical realm as opposed to the events of the hotel all just being in his head. While most of the events in season 2 walk the line of being ambiguously supernatural, a lot of crazy shit goes down towards the end that seems to lean in the direction of there being some supernatural hijinks afoot. Kevin drinks poison, dies, enters the hotel, resurrects somehow, gets shot, dies again, re-enters the hotel, and resurrects again. Now, at first glance, it seems like the show is clearly setting up some sort of supernatural-esque plotline with Kevin being immortal perhaps. However, we can offer some rational explanations to all of this. Since Virgil lied to Kevin about the epinephrine, it is likely that the concoction he gave him wasn't truly fatal, which is why Michael was at the ready when he woke up. Or maybe Virgil was talking about more of a coma-like state, not like actual death. And then later when Kevin gets shot by John, returns to the hotel and quote-unquote comes back to life, this could simply have been an incredible amount of luck that led to the bullet not hitting any vital organs. So this could be supernatural. However, while a stretch, there are rational explanations for all of these events. Except the events that occur in the realm of the dead, specifically Kevin's first trip to the hotel after drinking the poison. Well, hang on now. Isn't it possible that Kevin's experience in this realm could simply be happening all in his head? By that I mean there is no actual metaphysical space where he's interacting with the consciousnesses. What is plural for consciousness? Like consciousnesses. Whatever. He isn't actually interacting with the spirits of dead people. He is just pulling information from his subconscious to fill in the gaps. This is exactly what they imply with Ghost Patti. Originally, Kevin presumes he is actually speaking with the spirit of the deceased Patti, since she relays to him information he doesn't know. But then Laurie tells him that, having been Patti's therapist for 3 years, she told him all sorts of stuff about Patti, which he likely subconsciously absorbed. The show establishes that both Patti being some sort of specter and her just being a figment of Kevin's subconscious are valid interpretations. Oh, okay, so perhaps Kevin's entire adventure in the hotel may simply be him running through his own subconscious, right? Well, no, since there is certain information expressed in the hotel that there is no way Kevin could possibly know. For example, if the hotel was simply a mental projection of Kevin's, then why was Virgil there? Virgil told Kevin he was going to wake him up with the epinephrine, so there is no way Kevin would know, or would even presume, Virgil would be present in this lane of the dead. Well, okay, maybe Virgil in this realm is not the actual Virgil, but simply Kevin's mental projection of his own psyche. Well, okay, but then what about when he speaks with his father through the television set? Kevin Garvey Sr., via the time-tested method of tripping absolute fucking balls, is somehow able to communicate with Kevin in the hotel, thus implying that this is some sort of metaphysical realm that your consciousness can access not only through death, but via the use of psychedelic drugs. However, perhaps this is simply another mental projection by Kevin. There was a scene earlier in the season where Kevin Sr. states he is going to Australia. So perhaps him mentioning he is in Perth was, again, simply Kevin's mind conjuring an image of his father. Like, okay, I guess that's possible. But now we come to Neil, Patti's ex-husband. So it's established that Kevin most likely heard about Neil from Laurie, who was Patti's therapist. Okay, sure, but why is Neil present in this realm of the dead? Well, per Neil, he died by choking on a piece of chicken. Okay, that's fine, but how would Kevin know that? How would he know that Neil is dead? Well, maybe Laurie told him. Well, no, that doesn't actually make any sense. See, in the first season during the flashback of Patti's therapy session, there is a sort of throwaway joke about Patti leaving a bag of dog shit on Neil's porch. Earlier in said season, Patti is shown leaving a bag of something on presumably Neil's porch. Thus, it is implied that at this point, Neil is still alive. So if Neil is here in the hotel, then he presumably must have died at some point between the events in Mapleton in Season 1 and the events in Jarden in Season 2. Like, okay, that seems reasonable. The issue is, how would Kevin know this? I guess he was the chief of Mapleton, so if Neil died, he would have maybe heard about it. But in the scene where Laurie discusses her telling Kevin about Neil, she not only doesn't mention anything about his death, but Kevin mentions he doesn't even remember her telling him about Neil at all. And regardless, it's unlikely Laurie and Kevin had all that much contact after the events of Season 1 until they chat in Season 2. Also, even if I give the benefit of the doubt and say, I don't know, maybe Laurie didn't hear about Neil dying, but Kevin did somehow, but he forgot about it. But now we have to talk about David Burton. So David Burton is a character first mentioned in the first episode of Season 2. In Jarden, there is an odd man who spends all day standing atop a pillar in the town square, who gives Michael a letter addressed to a man named David Burton. In episode 3, a news report states that said man died during a rock climbing accident outside of the city of Perth, Australia, yet seemingly resurrected. One witness states that Burton claims he had, quote, just been in a hotel. Now later in the season we learn from Virgil that the Pillar Man, whose name is Edward, had also sought the counsel of Virgil at some point and entered the realm of the dead only to be brought back to life. Therefore, the clear implication is that the hotel is some sort of actual shared metaphysical space, hence why David Burton also went to the hotel upon his death before coming back to life. This also implies that Edward must have interacted with Burton when he crossed over into the realm of the dead. Kevin also interacts with Burton in both of his trips to the realm of the dead, even though this man is not confirmed to be Burton until Season 3. Like, okay, I've ranted enough. The point I am getting at is that the hotel that Kevin travels to is heavily implied to be an actual, tangible, otherworldly space that the spirits of the dead actually inhabit, and not just a manifestation of Kevin's mind. By that I mean he is actually interacting with the passed on souls of Virgil, Neil, and of course Patti. So what is the issue with this? Well, nothing in and of itself. If the show is heading into an explicitly supernatural direction, that's fine I suppose. However, like I said, it is a clear deviation from what came before. Previously, any possible supernatural occurrence was left up to the viewer. But here we see the show basically implying that this is a supernatural occurrence, which I don't truly understand why they did this. Lindelof has said that every occurrence in the show has some possible rational explanation, but I just don't buy it in this case. And it's not like they couldn't have structured it in a way to make it ambiguous. There were ways to leave this open-ended with both a supernatural and rational interpretation being possible. Honestly, I think this was just a case of the writers getting a bit too crazy and not considering what the implications of the realm of the dead would be on the rest of the series. Okay, but again, you said this isn't inherently bad, so what's your gripe here? Well, and look, I don't want to come off as too much of a hater or negative the net, but frankly, I was a bit worried that co-creator Damon Lindelof would get a bit too, how do I put this, Damon Lindelof-y. Look, it's not like I have a chip on my shoulder about Lindelof or anything. I mean, shit, he made one of my favorite shows of all time, and for better or worse, the cat has one hell of an imagination, and isn't afraid to let it rip. But therein lies the issue. With, say, Lost and HBO's Watchmen, while I appreciated the ambition, at some point, his ideas supersede the characters and the story, instead of the former being in service to the latter. For me, International Assassin was the pinnacle of Lindelof's creative prowess because it was able to perfectly mesh an absurdly audacious premise while having it all revolve around character and story. But, despite its brilliance, the episode kicked down the walls, so to speak, opened the floodgates. My fear was that the show would soon become more about this other realm, leaning into the heavy supernatural, or, Kevin being some sort of immortal messiah, and the character-centric focus would start to fade away. I was even more concerned that the writers would try to tie this realm of the dead in with whatever caused the sudden departure, which would have been in complete defiance of the entire thematic point. I was fearful that the show would become a parody of what it was, that it would go too far in the other direction, thus becoming like every other show, focused on just trying to wow the viewer instead of crafting a thematically cohesive and emotionally resonant tale. And to top it off, the end of season 2, despite its cathartic finale, left a number of plot and character threads unresolved, or at least in need of a more conclusive resolution. And with the third and final season only consisting of 8 episodes, I was skeptical to say the least that it would be able to wrap everything up while staying true to its roots and bring such a wildly audacious series to a satisfying conclusion. In my view, it would take nothing short of a miracle. And holy fuck, did they pull it off. This section isn't going to be as long as the previous two, since season 3 is far more character-centric, so I'll be discussing how the series concludes each character's arc in their individual sections. For now, I'm going to focus on how the show, by way of learning from the successes and failures of its previous 2 seasons, was able to craft what I consider to be one, if not the, greatest season of television of all time. So the first thing the show does so right is trim the fat. By that I mean, all secondary plots and/or character arcs were either streamlined or simply wrapped up immediately. Probably the most notable example of this is how the show goes about handling Meg and the GR. Considering how the end of season 2 came to a close, I feared that season 3 would end up focusing on Kevin once again facing off against the GR while trying to protect the citizens of Jarden. While I guess I could see a way this would work thematically, Kevin being given a second chance to redeem himself, I think most would agree that come the end of season 2, the GR storyline had sort of run its course. But seeing as the conclusion of the previous season saw Meg and her GR followers successfully taking over the Jarden Visitor Center, obviously the show couldn't just leave that hanging. What are they gonna do? Just carpet bomb the entire GR so they don't have to worry about it anymore? Oh, Wait, that's exactly what they did. Well, drone strike to be more exact. The government seems to have grown sick of the GR's shenanigans, so they blow them to smithereens and blame it on a gas leak. The show actually does incorporate both Evie and Jill into the plot later in the season, but I can't help but be tickled by the idea that it seems more than likely the writers were like, we don't really know what to do with the GR from here on out, so fuck it. Let's just literally decimate that plot altogether. Unironically, top tier writing. Not only did the writers swiftly get the GR plot off their plate, but they also scaled back the focus on a number of characters, namely Jill, Tom, and the entire Murphy clan. This is a difficult, but in some cases necessary trigger you have to pull. As a writer, you need to focus on the essential aspects of your show and not try to juggle a dozen different characters, which in most cases will lead to everyone getting shortchanged to some extent. The final season opts to instead focus on 5 primary characters: Kevin, Nora, Matt, Laurie, and Kevin Garvey Sr., which given his limited role in the previous 2 seasons was a surprising choice, but it turned out remarkably, with each episode keeping with season 2's practice of sticking to a singular character's POV. In order, each episode follows the POV of Kevin, Nora, Kevin Sr., Kevin and Nora in a double POV episode, Matt, Laurie, Kevin, and Nora. As you can see, the season is clearly weighted toward Kevin and Nora, since their relationship becomes the central focus of the show, which is the main reason it excels to such an incredible degree. See, despite the end of season 2 being an incredibly emotional moment, it didn't really conclusively address the inner conflicts of either Kevin or Nora. As for Kevin, yes, he was able to rid himself of Patti and come to the realization that what he truly wants is to be with his family, but considering this is the exact same place he ends up at the end of season 1, and within a couple of months was prepared to yeet his life out the window, what is to say he won't eventually do it again? As for Nora, since season 2 is mostly focused on Kevin's attempt to salvage his relationship with her, not much time was spent really diving into her own inner conflict, namely her inability to come to terms with the loss of her children. So the end of season 2 doesn't really work as a fitting resolution, since there is nothing to ensure that Kevin and Nora's relationship isn't a ticking time bomb, and that is exactly what season 3 aims to explore. Will Kevin and Nora be able to once and for all overcome their inner conflicts and truly be present with one another? And thus, the fate of their relationship retroactively becomes the main dramatic question of the entire series. This is something the show was somewhat lacking in its first 2 seasons. It explored an array of themes related to faith, belief, grief, meaning, etc., but what is the heart of the show, in a sense? And this was finally found in the relationship between Kevin and Nora. Despite the amazing chemistry between Thoreau and Kuhn, Kevin and Nora's relationship is surprisingly underdeveloped throughout the series. But in season 3, both characters' inner conflicts and how each threatens to destroy their relationship becomes the central focus of the narrative. And thus, the question as to whether or not Kevin and Nora will be able to make their relationship work becomes a microcosm for the main dramatic question of the series. After such an inexplicably traumatic event like the sudden departure, can those left behind find meaning in a meaningless world? It is such a simple shift in focus, yet makes the final season that much more emotionally resonant. And how the final season goes about putting their relationship to the test is equally as well done. I repeat, as I have said many times on this channel, when it comes to creating dramatic conflict, think of the worst possible thing that could happen to your character and make that shit happen. And this is exactly what The Leftovers does. In the case of Nora, her entire existence following the sudden departure has been a sort of begrudging stasis. Despite her insistence that she has moved on from the loss of her children, it is blatantly obvious that she is unable to truly accept and process it. But when she is contacted by a mysterious group of physicists who tell her that they have discovered a way to send her wherever her children departed to, her true feelings are revealed. If she truly was over the loss of her children, then she should have no problem turning them into the DSD as fraudsters who are taking advantage of the desperate. and yet she ends up flying halfway around the globe and begging them to take her money to allow her to undergo the procedure, one which involves submerging her in irradiated metal and blasting her with neutron radiation. Despite her denial, the truth is that Nora desperately seeks closure and is willing to do whatever it takes, no matter how seemingly insane, to get it. In the case of Kevin, his conflict is particularly his inability to commit, to take on the responsibility that is thrust upon him. So with that in mind, where do we find Kevin at the beginning of Season 3? 3 years after the events of Season 2, Kevin has become the chief of police in Jarden. Thus, he appears to have accepted the responsibility he has been running away from throughout the series, and he seems to have a happy life with his family and a strong relationship with Nora. It seems like everything seems to be going swell for Kevin. Except, of course, until we realize he is still plagued by suicidal ideations and frequently makes trips back to the realm of the dead, as that is the only place he feels alive. Quick aside, as I mentioned, I was truly worried what direction the writers would go with in terms of the seemingly supernatural nature of the realm of the dead. I feared they would try to give some conclusive explanation, which would end up bogging down the season or result in a cornucopia of inconsistencies. But miraculously, the writers showed an incredible amount of restraint by basically saying, it doesn't really matter. Even after Kevin's final decisive return to the realm of the dead, the show never explains what the hell the deal is with this place. Is it all in Kevin's head? Is it truly some sort of metaphysical space where the consciousnesses here we go again. You know what I mean. Of all human beings exist after death? A conclusive answer is never given, and yet somehow it works. The show being more interested in how Kevin's experiences are what matters, regardless of whether or not they are grounded in any sort of rational explanation, which perfectly fits with the thematic contentions of the series. On the eve of the 7th anniversary of the sudden departure, Kevin learns that Matt has written a gospel about his journey to the realm of the dead in Season 2, and he, along with John and Michael, believe Kevin is some sort of messiah figure who must be in Jarden come the anniversary to ensure, something happens. They aren't really all specific about it. On top of that, Kevin Sr., having fucked off to Australia and dosed some pretty potent shit, believes a great flood is set to bring about the end of the world on the anniversary. And after the only man who can help him stop it is killed, Kevin Sr., having read Matt's book, seeks out his son and asks him to once again return to the realm of the dead, find this man, and save the world. Now, I am sure all of that might sound absolutely absurd, but again, it doesn't really matter, since regardless of the veracity of all of this, the key is how it thrusts Kevin into his worst nightmare. Here is a man who is terrified of responsibility, who runs at the first sign of people counting on him, yet conversely has always wished for some greater purpose, now being told he is the second coming of Christ and he is the only one who can save the world. In addition to both Nora and Kevin dealing with their own inner conflicts, said conflicts being brought to the forefront forces them to confront their incredibly dysfunctional relationship. Despite said relationship appearing ostensibly healthy, it is clear they are not able to truly be present or fully honest with one another. Case in point, we learned that at some point prior to Season 3, Christine resurfaced and petitioned for custody of Lily. Nora, not being able to see a mother in pain over losing her child, allowed the courts to return Lily to Christine. This left Nora in extreme distress, but of course, Nora and Kevin are unable to discuss it, fearing even the smallest crack might destroy their relationship. However, by the middle of the season, both have reached their breaking point and are fully honest with each other for the first time in probably years, after which they immediately break up. And we, the audience, fear they will not be able to reconcile. That is until the show's final 2 episodes, where we see both Kevin and Nora each take their own respective leap of faith. Kevin taking on the responsibility that has been thrust upon him and entering the realm of the dead once again, and Nora agreeing to undergo the procedure, which may send her to be with her children or result in her death. And as for how the show goes about concluding each, that we will discuss in a bit. The main takeaway from this section is how brilliantly the show was able to redeem itself By learning from its mistakes, recognizing what worked and what did not work, and being courageous enough to strive forward even when faced with seemingly impossible odds. The show began as a promising yet uneven meditation on loss and grief, plunged headfirst into a completely new direction, experimenting with structure and narrative, taking some audacious risks that seemed impossible to resolve in a satisfying manner, but in the final season was able to pull off an absolute miracle. Primarily due to focusing on, of course. So now we are going to go over each primary character and discuss their series arc. In some cases, I have grouped characters together for the sake of time, lulz, and or because talking about one is hard to do without talking about another. Just a heads up, these are my own interpretations of each character's arc. If you have a different take on a particular character or have anything to add, I would love to discuss it in the comments. But for now, let's hop in. I don't really have much to say about Jill and Tom, seeing as the show doesn't either. Oh, it's a deep burn! I already went over how Jill isn't given much to do in season 1. Again, her character conflict is driven by Laurie leaving the family, and since the two of them share hardly any screen time, there is very little opportunity for said conflict to be explored. There is the great beat of Jill threatening to join the GR to try and goad Laurie into stopping her, but that's pretty much it. Season 2 doesn't have much for her to do either. Once again, she and Laurie are separated for the vast majority of the season, thus not allowing the writers to explore their dynamic. There is the romance with Michael, but that seemed mostly like filler. The one shining moment was at the end of the season when the mother and daughter finally have it out. Laurie desperately trying to apologize while Jill tries to reconcile the love and anger she holds for her. It was an excellent scene, but I can't help but wish we got more between these two. Season 3 sees Jill's character scaled back tremendously, her only making a short appearance in the first episode, and then her voice being featured on an admittedly significant phone call to Laurie in episode 6. In the 3 years between season 2 and season 3, it appears that she was able to mend her relationship with her mother. Would I have liked to see more of said reconciliation play out on screen? Of course, but considering how little it was developed in the previous seasons, I am okay with this being wrapped up so we could spend more time developing the more fleshed out characters. We learn in the series finale that at some point she married, had a daughter, and all things considered, turned out just fine. As for Tom, I have a bit more of a bone to pick. While Jill didn't have that much to work with from the get-go, Tom most certainly did, it simply went to waste. In season 1, we learn quite a bit about Tom. He is in fact not Kevin's biological son. His birth father is implied to have walked out on him and Laurie to start a new family. He witnessed 2 fellow students at his college commit suicide, and of course, he at some point was exposed to and joined Holy Wayne's movement. But despite learning so much about him, we are left with only questions. Specifically, how and why did he end up falling in with Wayne? Maybe when Laurie left to join the GR, he felt betrayed by her, just like he did with his biological father. Perhaps he felt as if he no longer truly belonged with Kevin and Jill. And obviously watching 2 fellow students commit suicide would be quite traumatizing. So, okay, we can surmise he felt lost, but what about Wayne sucked him in? Was it just a matter of circumstance? How did he even learn about him? Why join Wayne and not the GR with his mother? We learn of his past traumas, but don't get a sense as to how they connect to his development. Seeing as Tom and Christina are on the run for pretty much the entirety of season 1, there was plenty of opportunity to explore Tom's psyche via conversations between the two, but we really aren't given that much to chew on. Season 2 doesn't fare all that much better. Tom returns to Mapleton at the end of season 1 and joins his mother on her mission to deprogram GR members. Now, Laurie's motivation for doing so is very clear. She wants to both quell her guilt about abandoning her family and enact revenge on the GR, but her pursuits blind her from the fact that she is putting her own son in extremely dangerous situations, which in turn leads to him unraveling. We empathize with her, even as we see her clear ulterior motives. But with Tom, we're mostly left in the dark. Why did he team up with his mother? Why didn't he go back to Mapleton and reconnect with Kevin and Jill? Why does he end up falling for Meg's manipulation? With Laurie, we fully understand what her motivations are and why she does what she does. Simply put, she is a well-rounded character, whereas Tom feels more like a device, being moved around on the whim of the writers to serve the plot with no coherent idea as to what drives him, thus leaving him with almost nothing to build off of heading into the final season. Considering this, I think his reduced role in season 3 was the best way to go. He becomes a cop in Jarden alongside Kevin, and seems to have finally found a place he feels like he belongs, reuniting with his loved ones and maintaining strong relationships with them. We learn in the finale that his own marriage didn't turn out so great, but that he landed on his feet, so all's well that ends well, I suppose. Lindelof has said that one of his biggest regrets was not giving Jill and Tom enough spotlight in seasons 2 and 3. But frankly, I think pushing them to the sidelines so they could spend more time focusing on the more fleshed out characters was the right call. It's a hard pill to swallow, but sometimes cutting your losses is the best thing you can do for your show. Like with Jill and Tom, I don't have too much to say about the Murphys, since they aren't introduced until season 2 and aren't given that much development in season 3. First we have John. The fact that John has such a distaste for spiritualism and the idea of miracles, yet following the sudden departure, his home becomes the bastion for said things, is absolute dramatic perfection. John's anger and rage builds over the years following the departure, leading him to take extreme actions to rid his home of those he believes are false prophets, alienating his wife Erica in the process. It is only at the end of the season, following the discovery of Evie joining the GR, upon him reaching a state of complete helplessness and confusion, that he perhaps saw the need of latching onto something, anything for comfort, even if it isn't something that makes any sort of rational sense. This, in addition to Kevin's extension of friendship, even after he put a slug through his chest, set John on his journey to become a better man. Hence, 3 years later, John has become far calmer and more at peace, having found love with Laurie, and even worked with her to give others solace by using a palm reading con to help others move past their grief. However, it seems as though the trauma from Evie's death has made him take things a bit too far, as he buys into Matt's belief that Kevin is some sort of messiah figure, and later asks him to deliver a message to Evie in the realm of the dead, telling her that she was loved. In the end, upon being told by Kevin that he delivered said message, whether or not Kevin did truly speak to Evie's spirit, John was able to put her death behind him and move on. Erica's character arc takes a decidedly different path. In stark contrast to John, Erica is a woman who is torn between her belief in the spiritual that came about after the sudden departure and the despair and guilt she is burdened with following Evie's disappearance, leading her to then reject the idea of Jarden being some sort of safe haven. We learn later in season 2 that Erica was planning on leaving John, using her grandmother's method of burying a bird in a shoebox, which she had initially dismissed as meaningless superstition. She made a wish that should she leave, Evie would be okay without her. Thus, upon Evie's apparent departure, Erica blames herself. It is in the amazing face-off between the two women that Erica reveals Nora's own guilt in regard to her family's disappearance, despite Nora's insistence that she does not feel responsible. Upon the revelation that Evie did not depart, and instead joined the GR and her subsequent death, Erica divorced John and moved away from Jarden, though she and Nora still keep in touch. Since Erica was able to receive closure following Evie's death, it seems like she is on the road to peace. This is perhaps what drives Nora to eventually take her leap of faith come the end of the season, as she wants said closure for herself. While she is not featured all that much in season 3, a shame seeing as Regina King is always a delight, it was nice to see her character receiving a relatively happy ending. Michael is meh. Like Jill and Tom, Michael kind of got lost in the weeds. The idea of him being a young preacher in Jarden, his own sister possibly departing, and him maintaining a relationship with his grandfather Virgil in defiance of his parents are all interesting jump points, but the show doesn't do much with any of them. And then there is the relationship with Jill, which goes absolutely nowhere. As the season goes on, he begins to question the belief that Jarden is miraculous, but it isn't really developed and is more fleshed out in regard to Erica's arc. In season 3, he mostly just tags along with Matt and John as they pursue their belief that Kevin is the Messiah. But again, sometimes you just have to cut your losses. And then there is Evie, the most underdeveloped, yet conversely fascinating member of the Murphy family, at least in my opinion. Chronologically, we first meet Evie a few years before the events of season 2, where she has a chance encounter with Meg. Even here we see the seed of nihilism that would eventually lead to Evie being manipulated by Meg to join the GR. Her seemingly being disillusioned over Jarden being deemed a miraculous location, as it doesn't give those who travel there any solace, Meg included. At some point after the events of season 1, Meg contacted Evie and began her plan to lead a GR assault on the town of Jarden. But of course, the question remains. We understand that Evie seemed a bit jaded by the hysteria surrounding Jarden, but why would a young girl who had a seemingly happy family and so much going for her join the GR? One of the more interesting theories I have come across is that she was molested by her grandfather Virgil. Throughout the season, we learn that years previous, John tried to murder Virgil and was sent to prison for 6 years. It seems to be implied that Virgil molested John at some point, which is what led to John's bitterness and rage. However, this theory has some holes. I suppose it is possible that John was molested by Virgil when he was a boy, but would John seriously go on to marry the daughter of the man who molested him? Another theory is that Virgil molested Erica when she was a girl. John found out about it years later and shot Virgil out of revenge, which I think is a bit more sound. However, another theory states that Virgil molested Evie. This not only explains why John tried to kill him, but given the trauma it inflicted upon Evie, this is what made her susceptible to Meg's manipulation. I think this particular theory connects the most dots, but it comes with its own share of questions, particularly why Michael would maintain a relationship with Virgil if he knew he molested Evie, though it is possible that John and Erica lied to Michael about what he did. Regardless, none of this is ever explicitly explained. Thus, Evie's reason for joining the GR is left mostly ambiguous. However, though it may sound like a cop-out, I think this was sort of the point. The audience is meant to be in the same state of horror and confusion as John and Erica are upon seeing that they have completely lost their daughter with no rhyme or reason as to why. When you consider John's seething rage and Erica's clear resentment for him, it all paints a picture of a troubled and broken family with the inability to communicate with one another. Perhaps Evie grew sick of perpetuating the charade, and eventually it becomes too much for her to take. I could sit here forever and speculate, but as is thematically harmonious with the series, I feel it is meant to be a mystery we aren't supposed to know the answer to. However, perhaps the most horrifying detail of Evie's tale comes in the first episode of Season 3. After taking control of the Jardin Visitors Center, Evie asks Meg what they are waiting for. Shortly after, the Visitors Center is destroyed and the GR members inside are killed by the drone strike. It is clear based on Meg's demeanor right before the strike that this is what she was hoping for all along. But it is also clear that Evie was not aware of Meg's true motive, thus implying many of Meg's followers were unwillingly led to their deaths. Upon realizing Meg's true intention, Evie runs outside to see the drone strike is imminent. Realizing that Meg manipulated her, that the GR truly had no answers, and she abandoned her family for nothing, right before her life comes to an end. It is perhaps one of the most horrifying fates of the show, meant to demonstrate how even the most seemingly happy people can be consumed by despair and taken advantage of by a dangerous cult such as the GR. Speaking of which, to properly discuss the characters of Patti and Jill, we first need to establish, to put it bluntly, what the fuck the GR's deal is. As I said, in the novel, the GR is explicitly a religious organization who interpreted the sudden departure as an act of God signifying the end times. But since that context is not present in the show, more than a few things got lost in translation. So what exactly is the GR's intent? Well, that is pretty clear. To prevent the world from forgetting the sudden departure occurred, from pretending that it didn't happen, from acting as if everything can go back to normal. They do so by way of, as they put it, acting as living reminders. Okay, but to what end? Why are they so hell-bent on preventing the world from moving on? Well, I believe the answer can be found by first acknowledging how contradictory the GR is as an ideological organization. They go to extreme lengths to strip themselves and everything around them of any sort of value or meaning, hence why they dress in all white, are not allowed any personal mementos, and are not allowed any contact with their loved ones. Anything that tethers them to any sort of greater purpose or meaning is forbidden. And yet, the organization is, in and of itself, something people are drawn to in an attempt to find said meaning. There is a particularly enlightening scene in the 6th episode of the 3rd season, a flashback of Laurie attending to one of her patients, a mother whose baby departed. The mother, in despair, asks Laurie what she should do in order to move on, a question that Laurie does not know how to answer. The mother then lambasts her, stating that at least the guilty remnant will give her some direction, regardless of whether or not it makes a lick of rational sense. Following the sudden departure, there was a sort of vacuum of faith, and in that vacuum, countless lost souls were so desperate for something, anything to latch onto, that they joined the ranks of the GR. And thus, the irony is that while the guilty remnant seeks to strip the world of meaning, those who fall under their influence are themselves desperate for said meaning. Okay, so we sort of understand why the GR ends up attracting so many people, but that still doesn't necessarily answer the question as to what the purpose of the GR is. We understand what they want, but why? Well, let's discuss what is known as crab mentality. If you put a single crab in a bucket, the crab can easily crawl its way out. But when you put a bunch of crabs in a bucket, if one of the crabs tries to make it out, the other crabs will pull it back down, hence collectively condemning themselves to doom. Once you view the GR through this lens, everything becomes clear. What initially caused so many lost souls to join the GR was their immense grief, pain, and absence of meaning. And yet, they sought out the GR specifically because it gave them some sense of direction, some sort of purpose. Furthermore, while the GR seems to be in stark opposition to the idea of family or community, what is the GR if not a sort of twisted family? A group of people who find comfort in knowing that there are others who feel their pain, who understand them. Hence, the recurring mantra we hear from the GR throughout the series. And this brings us to Patti. Chronologically, our first introduction to Patti is her attending a therapy session with Laurie, shortly before the sudden departure. We learn of Patti's abusive marriage to Neil and that she suffers from extreme anxiety and dread, believing something terrible is going to happen. Following the sudden departure, Patti's fears were not only validated, but so many across the world were suddenly shouldered with her same afflictions: helplessness, despair, and isolation, which in turn led to her finally feeling as though there were others who understood her pain, and thus instilled in her a conviction. But the most interesting revelation of her character comes in Season 2's International Assassin. It is in the hotel where we see the two conflicting sides of Patti: the cult leader who led countless people to destroying their own lives, and the traumatized victim of abuse at the hands of Neil. Yet it is with her final monologue that Kevin, and we the audience, finally understand her. She tells the story of how, in an attempt to leave Neil and start anew, she went on Jeopardy! And won $65,000, more than enough she would need to leave Neil. But sadly, she could not bring herself to do so. It was the same fear that prevented her from leaving Neil that led to her joining the GR, of admitting, simply, that she is scared. Of life, of living without meaning, of dying without anyone remembering her. The show does not ask us to pity or forgive her. It simply wants us to understand her, and in that regard, crafts a brilliantly layered and complex character. So now let's talk about Meg. Meg is quite the contemptuous character among the fandom, with some considering her the most baffling of the series, which sort of makes sense given the fact that her character was more or less a remnant of a subplot from the book that got scrapped halfway through Season 1. However, I would argue she plays a vital role in establishing the main thematic intention of the show. It is established that following the sudden departure, any dogs that witnessed the event seem to snap, reject their domestication, and revert to their primal instincts. There is a scene in the pilot episode where two of Jill's friends, twin brothers Adam and Scott Frost, who would later go on to find employment in the city of Gotham, are helping her bury the dog killed at the beginning of the episode when Scott states,
"Dogs are just animals, man. They're not like us, trying to reason it all out and make sense of shit that makes no sense. They see something like that, and they just snap. They just go primal, man. Same thing's gonna happen to us, it's just taking longer."
The idea being that we as humans are, at our core, animals, and thus capable of going primal. But it is our capacity for searching for meaning that keeps us civilized. But what happens when we forego said search and give in to those primal instincts? It was only a day after Meg's mother's passing that the sudden departure occurred, thus preventing Meg from being able to process her death. As Matt puts it, her grief was hijacked. It was this inability to process her loss that led to her subsequent depression, which led to her being recruited by the GR. But as we see, she was not yet completely lost to despair. Following Matt reminding Jill of her mother, she reacts in a violent rage. Like many GR members, despite her best efforts to quell her connection to others, her humanity, her capacity to feel, are still present. But by the end of the season, communicated via a scary as fuck death glare, Quick aside, Liv Tyler is insanely good at pulling off the seemingly innocent but secretly cutthroat vibe. It is evident that she has been completely consumed by nothingness, and that is exactly the Meg we meet in season 2. By the time we catch up with her, she has fallen victim to the very thing Scott was speaking of, the inevitability of existing in a world without purpose. Her final coup de grace on Jardin is a representation of what she has become, a bottomless black hole consuming everything in her path. Meg is the ultimate representation of the risk of not finding meaning, demonstrating what awaits our characters if they are unable to find a purpose in their own lives. And thus, while some may feel she is quite the static character, I consider her essential to the series. Aside from Jill and Tom, well actually probably more so, Kevin Garvey Sr., up until season 3, was the most underdeveloped and frankly sort of confusing principal character of the series. Prior to the events of the show, he was the renowned chief of police of Mapleton, but shortly after the sudden departure, he began hearing voices in his head, which led to him committing undisclosed acts of violence and eventually being committed to a mental health facility. He isn't featured all that much in season 1. He only has a few scenes with his son where they discuss the latter's own mental instability. He ultimately ends up escaping from the facility and meets with Kevin Jr., informing him that he has some sort of higher purpose before being taken back to the hospital. In season 2, he is featured even less. We learn he has been discharged from the hospital and that the voices in his head have told him to go to Australia. Later in the season, he is somehow able to communicate with his son in the realm of the dead while high as a fucking kite. So yeah, I don't know exactly what the show had planned for him going into the final season. Was he simply written as some sort of antagonist for his son moving forward? Or maybe there was a plan to have Kevin Jr. truly be some sort of messiah figure and have his father be a spiritual guide of sorts? Regardless, I personally wasn't all that focused on, nor did I think the writers would even give all that much attention to Kevin Garvey Sr. heading into the final season. But goddamn, was I wrong. Somehow the show was able to not only retroactively flesh out Kevin Sr.'s characterization over the course of a single episode, but also write him beautifully into the climax of his son's arc, setting up a touching reconciliation between father and son. But before we get to that, I want to give praise to one particular shot. Episode 3 of season 3 opened with this shot of Kevin Sr., his back to the camera, mere moments after the sudden departure, looking upon the chaos. And dare I say, this single shot, an incredible piece of visual storytelling, gives us more insight into Kevin Sr.'s character than the entirety of the first 2 seasons. Here is a man who was shown to be charismatic, confident, in control, who the entire community revered, who they trusted to keep them safe. And yet, following something so unbelievably inexplicable, the weight of that responsibility caused his mind to fracture. In season 3, we pick up with Kevin Sr. in Australia, towards the tail end of his quest to collect a number of indigenous chants, which he believes will stop a great flood destined to end the world come the 7th anniversary of the sudden departure. But things become complicated when Christopher Sunday, the owner of the last song, is killed. In response, Kevin Sr. seeks out his own son, who according to Matt's book is able to traverse the realm of the dead. He asks him to find Christopher Sunday and retrieve the song, thus preventing the flood. Now later we'll discuss how this acts as a beautiful climax for Kevin Jr.'s arc, but for now, I want to discuss how the show was able to set up such a brilliant reversal of their father and son dynamic. Even before the sudden departure, the relationship between the father and son was a bit testy. We get a sense Kevin Jr. feels inferior to his father, who was the quote-unquote top dog in Mapleton, and that he was never truly there for him. This is only amplified following October 14th, 2011. Not only does Kevin Jr. resent his father for leaving him with the towering responsibility of keeping order in Mapleton, but also, as he puts it, for infecting him with the same mental affliction he suffers from. And yet, years later, when his father asks him to help him save the world, it is Kevin Jr. who answers the call. A man who feels as though he has every justification to deny his father's request, who is horrified in the face of such responsibility. It is made clear that Kevin Jr. doesn't even believe that there is some apocalyptic flood that threatens the world. Yet, he does it anyway. Being there for the father he feels was never there for him. Upon Kevin's return from the land of the dead, having failed to retrieve the song of Christopher Sunday, we see the skies have cleared, thus proving Kevin Sr.'s prediction of a world-ending flood as false. We see the weathered old man at a loss. The prophecy he thought both he and his son were at the center of was false. So where does that leave him? Kevin Jr. takes a seat next to his father, who is terrified of coming to terms with there being no greater purpose for himself. Incidentally, the exact same conflict Kevin Jr. expressed to his father years ago, to which his father said to him,
"You have no greater purpose, because it is enough."
We see the roles of the two men reversed. Kevin Sr. was once the man who had all the answers, but after crumbling under the pressure of the immeasurable responsibility thrust upon him, he desperately sought to find a greater purpose for himself. And in the end, upon being faced with the reality of there being no said greater purpose for him, he utters what is perhaps the most thematically resonant line of the entire series.
Now what?
And his son simply contemplates this question, neither man knowing what comes next, but trusting that, whatever it might be, they will face it together. In the end, just them being there for each other is enough.
You know there are two of those bitches in white standing out front right now smoking their fucking cigarettes? They probably think your patients are easy pickings. If I asked them to tell me what to do, they'd at least write it down for me. Tell me what to fucking do.
I don't know.
I have spoken on this channel before about the difficulties of adapting characters from the page to the screen. In novels that utilize certain points of view, the writer is allowed the freedom to explicitly express their inner thoughts of their characters via their internal monologues. But you can't do this as extensively in a visual medium. The reason I bring this up is to note that Laurie Garvey must have been an absolute nightmare to adapt to the screen, considering that, being a member of the guilty remnant, she has taken a vow of silence, and barring a few instances where she writes stuff down, and the episode where we see her pre-sudden departure, Laurie speaks a total one word over the course of the entire season, thus trying to communicate the insanely conflicted emotions going on in her mind solely through action must have been incredibly difficult. In fact, it turns out Laurie was so underwritten on the page that actress Amy Brenneman had to constantly call Damon Lindelof to ask him what emotions were going on in Laurie's head during certain scenes so she could accurately act them out. I don't necessarily blame Lindelof or any of the writers for this. Again, adapting a character's internal monologue completely to action is insanely difficult. So why am I bringing all this up? No real reason other than to say that Amy Brenneman is an absolute fucking force. Let me make it clear that everyone in the series brings their absolute A-game, but I want to take a moment to give praise to Amy's unbelievable performance, particularly in season 1, as I feel she doesn't get the credit she rightfully deserves. It is unreal how she can communicate so much nuanced emotion without a single word. She may not be able to say what she is thinking, but holy fuck, can you feel it? With that said, let's talk about Laurie. Pre-sudden departure, Laurie was perhaps the most well-adjusted character of the entire show, but her world was shattered when, following an argument with her husband Kevin, she learned she is pregnant with a child we later learn she does not want. And October 14th, 2011, she witnesses her fetus disappear from her womb. Laurie's resulting guilt and despair led to her being unable to continue her practice. How can she help people overcome their own despair when she isn't able to do so herself? This realization led to her attempting suicide, but she immediately changed her mind. Not wanting to die, but not knowing what else to do, she sought out the guilty remnant, which is where we catch up with her at the beginning of season 1. Despite her apparent loyalty to the GR, it is evident that she is struggling to truly disconnect herself from her past life. Despite how desperately Laurie wants to rid herself of any and all connection as a way to cope with her pain, she is unable to fully let go. It is only at the very end of the season when Jill tries to goad Laurie into speaking to her by threatening to join the GR, and then gets trapped in one of the GR houses that has been set ablaze, we hear her exclaim the only word she speaks since joining the GR.
No!
Thus signifying her choosing her family over the cult. In the end, she is broken free from the GR, but is now shouldered with the guilt of alienating her family and putting her own daughter in harm's way. Laurie's role in season 2 is significantly scaled down, but takes the character in a far more interesting direction. After reuniting with Tom at the end of season 1, the two of them seek to help free others from the GR by way of Tom infiltrating different chapters and convincing members to attend a support group led by Laurie. All the while, Laurie is writing a book about her experiences in the GR, which she hopes will help expose their coercive ways. However, it is made clear that Laurie isn't dealing with her turmoil in the most, healthy of fashions. Though her goals of helping GR members and wanting to expose the organization to the world may seem magnanimous, as Tom points out, there is a more self-serving motivation behind her actions, namely her wanting to dispel the guilt and shame she feels for abandoning her family. Her rage towards the GR, a manifestation of her own self-hatred. But she was so dead set on trying to fill the hole still within her that she was blind to her own son unraveling before her very eyes. And her inability to recognize this sooner is what eventually leads to him falling under the spell of Meg. Despite having left the GR, we get the sense that Laurie is still just as lost as ever. Things take a turn for the worse when Susan, a woman who Laurie and Tom were able to help leave the GR and return to her family, was unable to overcome her sorrow and ended her life, along with her husband and young son. Upon hearing this news, Laurie lashes out during a meeting with a potential publisher, seemingly having lost faith that her efforts are making any difference at all. It is then that her and Tom come to the realization that the reason so many flock to the GR is because, despite its destructive nature, they are at least given something to believe in. Something to fill the void that was left following the sudden departure, which is what ends up leading to her and Tom deciding to co-op Holy Wayne's story. Though it is a lie, at least it is able to give people some comfort. But there is a difference between coping and truly moving on. The only true way to carry on with your life is to face the root of the problem. Hence why neither the support group nor the book were able to truly allow Laurie to make progress with addressing her despair. The only way she can do so is to confront her issues head on, which is what sends her to Jarden in search of her son so she can mend their relationship, which is what motivates her to be there for her ex-husband after seeing the dire mental state he finds himself in. And, of course, which leads to her reaching out to the person who her abandonment of stands as the root of her despair, her daughter Jill. Again, I do wish we could have seen more of their reconciliation play out on screen, but seeing Laurie attempting to directly address her mistakes and make amends is a lovely note to end her season 2 arc on. It will be a difficult road, but she is finally on the right path. And upon catching up with Laurie 3 years following the events of season 2, it seems things have certainly gotten better for her. She appears to have patched things up with Kevin, Jill, and Tom, and is now married to John. And it seems like the entire clan is happy and doing well. But as we discover in the 6th episode of the final season, Laurie's second POV episode of the series, the despair and guilt and shame that drove her to nearly ending her life and later join the GR truly never went away. The previous episode saw Laurie traveling to Australia after learning that Kevin is in the midst of another psychotic break. Throughout the episode, we follow Laurie's interactions with both Nora and Matt, the former of whom she helps prepare for and eventually sees off to undergo the process to be with her children, and the squad who wants to convince Kevin to return to the realm of the dead. Believing the idea that Kevin is some sort of messiah is ridiculous and that the others are simply enabling his mental illness, Laurie ends up drugging them all with dog meds, based, so she can have a final conversation with Kevin alone. One that goes in a decidedly different direction than we would expect. This scene in particular is one of my favorites of the series. To show these characters who have been through so much hell and conflict, who could find countless reasons to be bitter and angry at one another, to see them pushing all that aside and being completely honest and at peace with one another was very touching. There was a time in season 2 when I feared they were going to try and rekindle Kevin and Laurie's romance, and I think a lesser show would have done so. But to see them understanding that their time together is over, that they are happy for one another finding someone new, and truly wanting what's best for each other, is very beautiful. We see them both putting their time together to rest and choosing to see the good in what they have accomplished, namely raising Jill and Tom. However, instead of Laurie trying to talk Kevin out of traveling back to the realm of the dead, she seems to accept his decision to do so. And following this scene, the audience is given the gut punch of Laurie preparing to commit suicide by way of disguising it as a scuba accident, per the conversation she has with Nora earlier in the episode. Ultimately, while Laurie was able to begin again to some extent, reconciling with her family and finding new love, the guilt of her abandoning her family still haunted her. And as heartbreaking as a turn this was, I think it was an important one to highlight. Overcoming trauma, despair, what have you, is not always an end destination, but rather a constant day-to-day struggle. And sadly, in some cases, that struggle can simply be too much, as we see with Susan in Season 2. In Laurie's case, given the opening scene of the episode, and her allowing both Nora and Kevin to head towards their own respective final destinations without trying to stop them, it seems to me that Laurie's decision to end her life was as a result of her feeling as though she was no longer able to truly help anyone. The way in which Laurie goes about fending off her despair is by trying to help others, as a therapist, as a counselor, as a fraudster. Perhaps she began to lose faith in the idea that she could truly save anyone, and thus, why should she even bother trying? But just before she is about to end her life, Laurie receives a phone call from Jill and Tom, happy, laughing, telling their mother they love her. And it was upon hearing the voices of her children that Laurie realized that despite the fact that she may not be able to truly fix anyone, that does not negate the good she has done in her life, and does not mean she is not deserving of being happy. In the series finale set years later, we see Laurie is still alive and well, showing that despite her despair, she was able to carry on. And here is where we come to my biggest gripe with the season, and perhaps the entire series. I don't mean Laurie not committing suicide. I think Laurie deciding to continue on, even though she may not be able to truly fix others, but can still have an effect on the world and those she loves, is a beautiful conclusion to her arc. My issue comes from the fact that the writers decided to bait her suicide at the end of the episode, only to reveal she did not in fact kill herself in the series finale. Like, at the end of the episode, it isn't implied to be a maybe she did, maybe she didn't sort of thing. I would argue it is clearly meant to imply she ended her life. Thus, on your first watch, you accept and process this. But then in the series finale, they were like, surprise, actually no. To me, this seemed like an egregious instance of a bait and switch. Now, it seems like the reason for this is that, according to interviews with Lindelof, the writer's room could not come to an agreement on whether or not Laurie would end her life at the end of the episode. That is what they originally were going to go with, but after the episode was penned, apparently the writers began to have second thoughts, feeling as though it was not a proper end for her character. Now, I am truly glad they decided to do so. For me, Laurie ending her life at the end of the episode just didn't sit right. Not from a, oh, that's really sad, I don't want her to die sort of viewpoint, but rather it didn't seem like it made all that much sense. Like, the reason Laurie decided to commit suicide in the opening flashback was because she felt as though she was no longer able to help anyone. But this episode seemed to be about her accepting she cannot save everyone. But that doesn't negate the good she has done and can do, even if she won't be successful every time. This is what finally allows her to overcome her despair and carry on. So to have it end with her committing suicide, like, I don't know, for me it just doesn't make any sense. And it seems like the writers felt the same way. But the fact that they did this bait and switch at all just seems really unnecessary. I didn't watch the show when it aired, but holy hell, if I went 2 weeks believing a character I love ended their life, processed this, and then in the finale it's like, psych. Like maybe in the moment I'd feel relief, but in retrospect, I'd personally call up Damon Lindelof and tell him to go throw a stick of dynamite. But overall, Laurie's arc is that of a woman who was left in despair upon believing she was no longer able to help those around her, which in turn led to her being taken in by a manipulative cult, which she was able to crawl her way out of due to the love of her family, only to be plagued with guilt and trying desperately to cope by helping others, but ultimately making peace with the fact that she can save everyone. And it was conversely accepting this that allowed her to finally move past her despair. To put it simply, Laurie had to accept that she would not be able to save everyone in order to save herself.
Because there has to be a reason.
Why?
Everything in my life I've done for a reason.
Why?
to help people, to guide them, to ease their suffering, even though I suffered myself. I sacrificed my happiness. I let my family abandon me. Why? For you!
Considering his novel counterpart is restricted to only a couple of scenes, it is astonishing what the writers and Christopher Eccleston were able to accomplish with the character of Matthew Jameson. Matt begins the series as a priest in Mapleton, who, seeking to prove the sudden departure was not the rapture, distributes a tabloid, exposing those who departed of their misdeeds, which, unsurprisingly, is not taken well by the townspeople. Throughout the series, Matt desperately tries to find meaning in his misfortunes, believing he is capable of interpreting God's plan for him. But what he comes to learn is that it is his attempt to do so that inevitably leads him to ruin. Given both textual references throughout the series, as well as comments made by the creators, no pun intended, Matt's arc is reminiscent of the Book of Job, aka fuck this one guy in particular. However, I don't actually think it is all that analogous to Matt's arc. It isn't so much that he questions God's reasoning for making him suffer, but rather he believes he knows God's intent with all of the things that happen to him throughout the series, and it is because of this that he ends up taking certain actions which lead to suffering. And thus, a better story to illustrate Matt's arc is The Parable of the Drowning Man, also known as Two Boats and a Helicopter, which just so happens to be the title of the first Matt-centric episode in Season 1. A man of faith lives a quiet life in his home in a small town. He hears on the radio that a storm is coming and that the town is to be evacuated. Instead, the man simply climbs on the roof of his home and waits, confident that God will save him. A boat filled with townsfolk being evacuated comes by, and the driver says, Hey bro, you should really get on here so we can take you to safety. And the man's like, nah, I'm good, I'm just waiting for God. And the driver's like, suit yourself, and rides off. Meanwhile, the storm gets worse. A rescue boat comes by the home and the driver says, okay, like bro, it's getting really bad. You should let us get you out of here. But the man says, I'm fine, God will save me. And thus, the second boat takes off. Now the storm is getting really, really bad. Finally, a helicopter flies by and the pilot says, dude, for real, it's mad fucked out here. Let us help you. And the man says, fuck off. I'm fine. God is going to save me. I just know it. And thus the pilot flies off. And the storm gets worse and worse, and the water gets higher and higher, and eventually the man drowns. Upon his death, the man arrives at the pearly gates and speaks with God and is like, you know God, I spent my entire life worshiping you, but when I needed you the most, you weren't there for me. How the fuck did I die? To which God responds with, bitch, I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. What the fuck else do you want from me? So in this story, God is not inflicting suffering on the title character. Quite the contrary. He is trying to help him. But it is due to the man's arrogant belief that he knows what is and is not part of God's plan, which in turn leads him to suffer. God is not the root of the man's suffering. He is his own. And this I find to be far more applicable to Matt's arc. In the first Matt-centric episode, Matt is told that his family church is to be foreclosed if he cannot come up with $135,000. Matt believes that God's will is for him to raise the money and reclaim his church, so he takes $20,000 and wins 3 rounds of roulette in a row, earning him more than enough to buy back his church. But on his way to the bank, he stops to help 2 GR members who were assaulted, is hit in the head with a rock by a passerby, and blacks out. He awakens in the hospital and races to the bank, arriving just in the nick of time, but then learns that he has been unconscious for 3 days and his church is lost to none other than the guilty remnant. So, what do we make of this tale? What was God's plan here? Did God truly send Matt on this journey, give him tremendous luck to win the money, only to viciously mock him at the end as all of his efforts were for naught? Or was it God's will that Matt was supposed to lose his church all along as part of some greater plan for him? Or did God have nothing to do with this and it was all just the chaos of the universe? Was this a curse, a blessing, or random chance? And this question is the foundation of Matt's arc. Ironically, Matt himself echoes this question at the beginning of the episode. When he was a boy, Matt became jealous of the attention his parents gave to his younger sister Nora after she was born. He then prayed to God to receive his parents' attention back. Shortly after, he was diagnosed with leukemia. And thus, once again we must ask, was this God granting his wish, albeit in a twisted manner? Was this God punishing him for being so selfish, or did God have no hand in this at all? Matt then says that this is a choice that everyone must make for themselves. But what Matt fails to realize is that by trying to assign his own interpretation of God's intent, he may inevitably be leading himself to ruin. At some point before season 2, Matt and his wife Mary, who fell into a coma following a car crash on the day of the sudden departure, moved to Jardin. On their first night in Jardin, Mary miraculously awakens and they make love. The next morning, Mary reverts to her comatose state, but later on, they discover that she is pregnant, despite them having been unable to conceive ever before this point. So now we come back to choice. Does Matt choose to believe that this was simply random chance, or that there is something mystical or special about Jardin that woke Mary up and allowed her to become pregnant? Naturally, he goes with the latter. But he doesn't just stop there. He doesn't simply appreciate these blessings, he takes it a step further, believing that Mary is destined to awake once again. He obsessively repeats the events of the day she awoke in a desperate attempt to try and get her to wake up again. And here is where we begin to see his outlook lead him astray. Despite the fact that Mary's awakening may have had nothing to do with God or Jardin at all, he is so set on his belief that it did, it drives him to take certain actions to follow what he believes is God's plan, never considering that he may be ignoring God's true plan for him and leading himself to suffering and ruin, which, as we see, he most certainly is. In that same episode, Matt and Mary are on their way back to Jardin when they come across a father and son, stranded after their car has broken down. The father proceeds to assault Matt and steal his and Mary's wristbands that allow them access into Jardin. Matt then sets off on a perilous journey to get Mary back into Jardin, fearing that if he does not, she will never wake again. But upon doing so, happens upon a car wreck, the driver being none other than the man who assaulted him, who has died in the crash. Matt retrieves his wristband, but then sees the young boy, who fearfully offers the other wristband back. And it is here we see Matt faced with a choice. In this moment, Matt is given the opportunity to view this as God allowing him and Mary to return to Jardin per his will. But instead, he does something different. He sends Mary back to Jardin with Nora and Kevin, but refuses to return himself, telling John he will only return when Mary awakens again, and asking him to help the young boy. It is here we see Matt not trying to dictate what he thinks God's intention is, but rather simply doing what he feels he should do as a man of faith. And here we see the two sides of Matt, a man who tries to control the will of God, and a man who does not assume God's plan and simply does what he believes is right. And we, the audience, hope the latter will eventually win out over the former. However, come season 3, we see Matt begin to stray down the path of the former and how it leads him to ruin. After learning of Kevin's supposedly miraculous double resurrection, Matt believes him to be a messiah figure, who, as long as he is in Jardin, is incapable of dying. Matt even goes so far as to pen a gospel about Kevin's trials and tribulations in season 2, known in the series as the Book of Kevin. On the eve of the 7th anniversary of the sudden departure, Matt is convinced that Kevin must return to Jardin to ensure whatever is supposed to happen does. Even after hearing that Kevin is most likely undergoing a psychotic break, even as Mary, who broke free from her coma at the end of season 2, and who Matt now forbids from leaving Jardin out of fear she will return to her comatose state, plans to leave Matt due to his obsession with Kevin being a Christ-like figure, even as those he loves desperately try to talk some sense into him, just like the man waving off those who try to bring him to safety, he firmly believes he is on the course God has set for him, even as he comes closer and closer to drowning. It is at this point that we, the audience, fear Matt will eventually destroy his life. But in the third and final Matt POV episode, a random chance encounter changes everything. While on his way to Australia to bring Kevin back to Jardin, all flights are grounded and they are forced to travel by ferry, where Matt comes across a man named David Burton, who claims to be God and who Matt witnesses throw a man overboard. In the climactic scene of both the episode and Matt's arc, he kidnaps Burton and confronts him about throwing the man overboard, although it is clear he is more peeved about him saying he is God. Burton claims that, as God, not only is he not the father of Jesus, thus there was no Immaculate Conception, but Jesus actually never rose from the dead. He simply had an identical twin brother who everyone presumed was Jesus a few days later. I just love how bizarre this whole situation is, how Matt laughs off Burton's assertions as absurdities, even though they are far more rationally plausible. Whether or not Burton truly is God is irrelevant, as the conversation soon pivots to Matt questioning his own beliefs. We learn that Matt's leukemia has returned, and he questions God, why he is seemingly being punished despite enacting his will. Burton states that everything Matt has done has not been for God, but for himself. Hence, this is why I don't believe Matt is analogous to Job, since Job was said to be a truly righteous man. Matt is a good man, but not truly righteous, since instead of simply acting as a man of faith would, as we see him do in Season 2, his actions have always had an ulterior motive. His faith was conditional. Thus, he is, in a sense, the anti-Job. Following his interaction with Burton, Matt's entire view of his faith seems to have changed. It isn't that he has lost his faith, but rather his relationship with God has shifted. The next morning, he abandons his desire to get Kevin back before the anniversary and tells his loved ones of his terminal illness. Instead of trying to dictate what he sees as God's will, he has now let go of the need to control his circumstances, allowing his life to play out as it will and not fool himself into thinking he has all the answers. But that does not mean he is free from fear or doubt. In Matt's final appearance in the series finale, Matt openly tells Nora of his fears, of dying, of losing Mary, of not being able to see his son grow up. But also, if he is to live, how he can guide others when he can't possibly know what will come. But despite his doubts, his final act is comforting his sister before she takes her leap of faith. And though we learn he passed away at some point prior to the time jump in the finale, it is implied he spent his remaining years with Mary and his son at his side. And thus, though he has accepted he cannot possibly know what is and is not God's will, he chooses to accept his life as it comes, cherish the blessings he is bestowed with, and comfort those who need his help the best he can. He has truly become a righteous man.
By now, she would have searched the house and found it empty. She had suspected it all along, and now she knew he was a coward. A coward dressed in the uniform of a brave man. Brave enough to cross 2 oceans and a continent to find her, to fight countless enemies, and yet, in the end, he was terrified. He was terrified of her. To lie beside her, to be comforted by her as he wept, to show her he was small, for her to know that and touch his cheek and whisper words softly into his ear. All of that was a nightmare. All he knew to do was run. He was alone. And all was well.
Kevin Garvey is no doubt one of the most psychologically complex characters of the series, but if I were to sum up his characterization with a single word, I'd probably go with confused.
What? 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 What?
Or perhaps conflicted is more appropriate. Even before the sudden departure threw the world into chaos, leaving countless people in utter despair, Kevin always seemed to have this problem. Even with a beautiful wife, lovely children, a seemingly picture-perfect life, it simply wasn't enough for him. He is constantly torn between the two conflicting aspects of his personality. The side of him that wants to embrace responsibility and commitment and see things through to the end, and the side of him that wants to forgo responsibility and commitment and yearn for some greater purpose. In short, he is a man constantly at war with himself. This internal battle is only exacerbated following the sudden departure. We see Kevin grow more and more desperate throughout Season 1, as his attempts to keep peace in Mapleton prove ineffective, threatening his own mental stability. He eventually resorts to kidnapping Patti while in one of his fugue states. To be clear, Kevin's main issue isn't simply the existence of these two conflicting aspects of his psyche. It is him being unable to choose one or the other that results in his despair. His mind literally cracking under the pressure. To borrow a line from another favorite series of mine, he keeps choosing half measures when he needs to go all the way. And now Kevin is finally put into a situation where a half measure just won't cut it. He needs to either face the consequences of his actions or embrace his dark side and finish what he started. And in the end, Kevin decides the former, accepting whatever outcome may be in store for him as he decides to let Patti go, which in turn leads to her suicide. Upon his return to Mapleton, Kevin is faced head-on with his ineptitude at keeping the peace in Mapleton. Though things seem dire, he is able to salvage what remains of his family, and as he returns home to find Nora and Lily waiting for him, we the audience are relieved to see that Kevin now has a second chance, an opportunity to begin again and finally be able to commit. But of course, this isn't how things turn out. It doesn't take long for Kevin's internal conflict to once again rear its head. Though it seems he was able to enjoy his new life with Nora, Jill, and Lily, we see Kevin's self-destructive nature once again attempt to foil it by digging up Patti's body and trying to get himself arrested. While his plan ultimately fails, we the audience are left asking ourselves,
What the fuck was that?
And the answer is Kevin once again trying to implode his life. Despite having a second chance to do things differently, he slips into his old habits. Even after insisting they all move to Jardin as a sort of fresh start, it takes less than a day before he already starts to self-sabotage. Despite him being the one who insisted they move to Jardin, he lambasts Nora for going all in, as he puts it, once again highlighting his inability to truly commit. His own self-sabotage aside, his new life in Jardin is threatened by his possible involvement in Evie's disappearance, the antagonism of Patti, and his suicidal ideation. This is another layer of Kevin's inner turmoil that was hinted at in Season 1, but is further explored in Season 2. If he can't commit one way or the other, perhaps the only way out is to put an end to things. The climax of Season 2 comes about after him opening up to Nora about Patti's torment and her subsequently leaving him. Faced with the prospect of once again losing his family, Kevin decides to take drastic measures to rid himself of Patti, which, in truly ironic fashion, requires him to die. Upon entering the realm of the dead, Kevin takes on the persona of his darker self, the international assassin, in order to rid himself of Patti's torment, after which he returns to the land of the living. But upon his second trip to the realm of the dead, rather than once again donning the role of the assassin, he instead takes the sheriff's uniform, choosing to take on the responsibility he has desired to escape. Upon returning to the land of the living, he returns home to find all of those he loves waiting for him, now seemingly rid of his self-doubt and hatred, and we the audience are sure, this time, that Kevin will now settle down and be content. Of course he won't. I've actually seen some fans argue that the series should have ended with Season 2, but the issue is that, despite Kevin being thankful for being with his family, this is no guarantee that he won't relapse into his old ways, that the other part of him won't once again threaten everything he holds dear. While he was successful in ridding himself of Patti, he is yet to confront that other side of himself, to prove he is willing to commit no matter what it takes. And this is exactly what Season 3 explores. I already discussed how throughout the series, Kevin and Nora's relationship really only worked because neither of them was truly present in a sense. Kevin was always putting on a show, masquerading as the strong, confident family man, even though he was filled to the brim with turmoil and fear. 3 years following the events of Season 2, he is only able to keep his relationship with Nora together because he has found another avenue of escape, via suffocating himself, which, as he says, is the only way he can truly feel alive. It is also evident that he is just as conflicted as ever. Upon learning of Matt's book, and his belief that Kevin is a messiah figure who is destined to accomplish some sort of prophecy come the 7th anniversary, Kevin reacts with hostility. But isn't this exactly what Kevin always wanted? Wasn't the entire reason he was discontent with his life prior to the sudden departure that he didn't have some sort of greater purpose? And yet now he is given one and is still unable to commit to playing the part. He has all of these conflicting notions about who he wants to be or who he thinks he needs or is supposed to be swarming around his head, like when you get the bonus round on a pinball machine and you have to juggle like 6 balls at once. It's enough to drive anyone crazy. Hence why he once again has a psychotic break, which ultimately culminates in him finally confronting Nora about their relationship. Kevin rightfully points out Nora's inability to reconcile her trauma, but neglects his own inability to do so. Thus, instead of them working things out, Kevin leaves her, just as she did to him in Season 2. It is then that Kevin's arc comes to its climax. Upon being asked by his father to re-enter the realm of the dead once again to save the world from the apocalypse, Kevin takes on the role of Messiah and agrees. In the climactic scene, Kevin sees the two sides of himself finally confronting one another. The side of him that seeks to take responsibility, represented fittingly by Kevin as the President of the United States, aka the most powerful man in the world, and the side of him that wants to run away. Of course, the assassin. How poetically beautiful is it that of all people, Patti, who Kevin helped reconcile her own conflicting personalities in Season 2, is here to help Kevin do the same, acting as a mediator between the warring aspects of his psyche. Upon finally coming face to face, the two sides of Kevin, via reading the chapter of the romance novel you heard at the beginning of the section, a symbolic representation of the deepest part of his subconscious, are forced to confront the truth, that the reason why he has always tried to sabotage his life is fear. Of failure, of defeat, of loss. And that is what Kevin has been running away from all along. The prospect of putting himself in such a position terrifies him. But that is the only way that you can truly open yourself up to honest, pure love. It is upon this revelation that the turmoil within Kevin finally comes to a resolution, as the side of Kevin that desires to take on responsibility and commitment kills his counterpart, thus allowing him to destroy this realm that he has yearned to escape to. But this is not the end of Kevin's arc. While it does appear that Kevin has been able to reconcile his inner conflict, we the audience need to see this in action, to see he is truly changed, which comes in the series finale. After spending years searching far and wide for Nora, Kevin confronts her and in a single final monologue shows just how much he has changed. How despite doubting himself, thinking he was a madman, he committed himself to finding her. Via this utter expression of emotion and vulnerability, we see Kevin has fully committed himself, no longer running away from something, but towards it. Kevin's arc is one that I reflect on often, thinking about what it is I want in my own life. How there is a risk in picking a path and sticking to it, there being a fear of failure, heartbreak, and loss, but that's the only way to truly live. You can't stand still. There are moments in life when you have to go all in and face whatever may come your way. It is a lesson I try to keep in mind every day. Of course, considering all the pros and cons of a particular decision, but upon making said decision, striving ahead without looking back. And that, at least in my opinion, is what life is all about. I'd say Kevin's arc is the one I resonate with the most on a personal level. But of course, there is one more character we have left to discuss.
My name is Nora Elizabeth Jameson Durst. I was born on November 18th, 1979. This is a copy of today's paper, because today is the day I'm leaving to be with him. I'm leaving to be with my children, Aaron and Jeremy. I'm ready to go now.
The brilliance of Nora's arc can be found both in its simplicity and how it perfectly embodies the main thematic question of the series. Upon being faced with something so utterly inexplicable, how does one find a way to carry on? As I have said before, the show is not religious, but it is about religion, or more accurately, faith in all its shapes and forms. Following the sudden departure, those who remained were thrust into a world where everything they thought they knew was completely upended, and thus they needed something to grasp onto. Hence, we see the rise of new belief systems. We as humans have the instinctual urge to explain the unexplainable, derive meaning in the meaningless. It is the only thing that prevents us from falling into despair, that keeps us moving forward. And then there's Nora. Now, I will be the first to say that Nora is not the easiest character to like, given her, how should I say, unorthodox ways of coping.
Do you want to go to Miami?
I live with my daughter, so
Oh, fuck your daughter.
Ooh, I like her.
Yet she is the perfect representation of the show's thesis. In the first season, we are shown how she is incapable of moving on, constantly plagued by the trauma of losing her husband and children, with seemingly no possible way to attain closure, and her attempts to do so, accepting the aid of Holy Wayne, her relationship with Kevin, adopting Lily, all inevitably end in disaster. Her despair grew so great that she couldn't even stand to see nor allow others to find their own ways to cope, hence her work with the DSD fraud department, unveiling the stories others choose to tell themselves to move on. But she does not do this out of innate malice, rather selfishness, hence her emotional beach ball speech, where she recognizes and laments her role in squandering the attempts of others to move on from their pain. She can't stand to see them finding ways to carry on while she is left standing still, even as she hates herself for doing so. Because in truth, no matter how many stories she proves false, no matter what she does to try to distract herself, none of it will allow her to receive closure. To do so, she needs to find a way, once and for all, to move on. This all builds to the final season when she is approached by a group of physicists who claim they can reunite her with her children via a method involving neutron radiation. Everything Nora is and knows is telling her that these are scammers. But after spending so many years standing still, trying and failing to move on, she is willing to do anything to find the closure she has always sought. And thus, she decides to take a leap of faith. Which brings us, of course, to the series finale, us picking up with Nora, it seems, more than a decade later. Kevin is able to track her down and questions where she has been all this time, to which she tells him she traveled to an alternate world where the 2% who departed from their world are still alive. She was able to find her husband and children, and, after seeing them safe and together, decided to travel back to her world, after which she went into exile. Now, in another video of mine, I went over my thoughts on the veracity of her story, but, of course, whether or not Nora's story is true is completely irrelevant. Whether Nora did in fact travel to this alternate world and find her husband and children safe, or called off the procedure at the last second, doesn't matter, since her putting her faith in this story, whether true or false, allows her to dispel her grief, guilt, and shame. What is so brilliant about this ending is that not only does it serve as the perfect culmination of both Nora's arc and the show's entire thematic thesis, but also as a perfectly meta-esque conclusion for those in the audience who were aching for a conclusive answer. When Nora tells her story to Kevin, prompting him to decide whether to believe her or not, this is, in a sense, the writers allowing the audience to choose their own path. If you are a fan of the series, or have at least watched this video in its entirety, you can surmise that what caused the sudden departure, and or where those who departed disappeared to, are irrelevant. And thus, these answers are never given in the show. The sudden departure is simply a device to explore how humans would react to such an inexplicable event. But, of course, this didn't prevent fans from trying to connect the dots, putting together clues or bouncing theories off one another during its run. In true meta fashion, the fandom itself was put into the same shoes as the characters, trying desperately to find an answer. And in the series finale, they were given one. But it is up for each individual viewer to choose what they want to believe, where they want to place their faith. Do you believe Nora's story? The choice is up to you. But of course, in the end, regardless of the veracity of her story, regardless of what the viewer personally believes is the truth, Nora Durst, a woman whose entire life was stripped from her in an instant, who was plagued with guilt and shame over her belief that she was responsible for it, whose attempts to move on all ended in disaster, by finally putting her faith in a story of her own telling, is finally able to be present, and finally carry on. So I went back and forth between ideas as to how I want to wrap this video up. Originally I was going to talk about the various themes explored throughout the series, faith in all its shapes and forms, how new belief systems are formed and why people are drawn to them. However, in retrospect, I feel like that would seem redundant, since this all seems implicit in our analysis of the series and its individual characters. But then there was something I realized only on my most recent rewatch of the series, a sort of common thread I noticed throughout all of the principal characters' arcs. Despite how disparate they may seem on paper, feeling powerless in the face of inexplicable hardship, afflicted by a life-altering crisis of faith, struggling with an inability to commit to a course of action, suffering a loss so great there seems to be no way to come to terms with it. Despite the various ways the characters go about trying to find meaning and purpose in their new world, it all comes down to finding solace in others. When asked what he personally believes happened to those who disappeared in the sudden departure, Tom Perrotta stated he never really gave it all that much thought, because it was never the point of the story. The departure was simply a device to pose a single question: how do we carry on after something so utterly inexplicable that defies all logic? And the answer is, we don't carry on. Rather, we carry each other. Through love, through family, through friendship, through simply offering a hand to those in need. No matter how meaningless or pointless or minuscule our actions may seem in a world full of loss, grief, pain, sorrow, and despair, in the end, all we have is each other. No one truly knows why we are here or where we go when it's all over, but we cling to one another in the face of that uncertainty. To me, storytelling is fundamentally about communicating a simple idea in the most interesting and captivating of ways possible. The Leftovers features an inexplicable rapture-like disappearance event, a deranged nihilistic cult, supernatural healers, miraculous cities, prophecies of the end times, human transportation devices that utilize neutron radiation, a possible second coming of Christ who can traverse the realm of the dead, and yet, at its core, it is simply a story about the importance of connection and community. That no matter what belief system you choose to put your faith in actuality, it all comes down to putting your faith in your fellow human being. And for me, that is The Leftovers' most beautiful and crowning achievement of all.
Everybody is wondering what and where they all came from. Everybody is worrying about where they're going.